Okay, we're going to start in about 1 minute. Okay, it is 10 o'clock on my end. Hello, everyone. I'm Rabbi Amy Bardack. I am the Director of Jewish Life and Learning at the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. And it's nice to see some familiar faces. I welcome all of you. This session is really designed to be a dive into the first instances of the term Tikkun Olam in our literature, in Jewish literature. And you do not need to have any background. We'll get into all the details, even if you haven't studied Talmudic texts. So everyone's welcome. No prerequisites necessary. I did put a Google Doc in the chat. I will also be sharing my screen. The Google Doc is the sources in case you don't want to look at the screen, you just want to look at the sources or print them out. You're welcome to do that. And I do want to start actually with a little bit of input from you in the chat, which is when you hear the term Tikkun Olam, what do you think of? What's your association with that term? Just write it into the chat to everyone, and we will read each other's. So don't be shy. There really isn't a wrong answer. What do you think of when you hear Tikkun Olam? Healing the world. Thank you, Arthur. Repair the world. Fixing the world. To repair the world, social action, social justice advocacy. Putting a shattered fixture back together. These are all great associations. So thank you. Need to be a partner in Hashem's creative activity. Great. So Tikkun Olam is a pretty well-known phrase. In fact, today, when I was reading the newspaper, the New York Times, on the very front page, where it gives you little tastes of the articles inside, it mentioned Tikkun Olam in an article called Faith-Based Investing in the business section. And it talked about how people look to their religious beliefs as guidance in how to invest. And it said in the middle of the article, people who invest in line with their Jewish faith often embrace the principle of Tikkun Olam, which calls for people to leave the world a better place. And then it profiles a fellow named Michael Wagner, no relation to our Pittsburgh Wagners, I don't think, from Miami, who's a wealth manager. And after volunteering with the Federation of Miami, he decided to start talking to his clients who were Jewish about adhering their investments to their Jewish values. And it closes with this quote. And Jeff, I hope you're still on, because if you haven't read this, this is like an awesome quote you're gonna plops. Being involved with the Jewish Federation, he said, has brought me great personal joy and satisfaction, Mr. Wagner said. I'm bringing that part of my personal life into portfolio management and feeling that we're doing good in the world. Is it a uniquely Jewish view? I'm not sure it is. It's a uniquely human thing, which also sort of ties into some of what people said about Tikkun Olam. It's not necessarily the way we use that phrase today, very tied into particular Jewish practice. It's a general term about making the world a better place or fixing or repairing the world. And this phrase became popular enough to eventually reach the New York Times today, only in the past 50 years or so, when the Jewish educator Shlomo Bardeen from the mid-20th century started to use it as a term to mean working to perfect the world. And it's become widely used by synagogues, Jewish organizations, camps, youth movements to refer to bettering the world, and by extension, humanitarian causes, social justice, values. and a pretty broad meaning. And it has even become known by people of other faiths in our country. For example, President Obama in his 2015 Passover greeting said, quote, "Together we can continue the hard but awesome work of Tikkun Olam and do our part to repair the world." And then Mr. Rogers, you got to mention him in Pittsburgh. Mr. Rogers, in his special TV show in the aftermath of 9/11, said, quote, "We are all called to be Tikkun Olam, repairers of creation." So it's really been part of the lexicon, even just of America, as a known term, which is extraordinary. But the term is very old. And tonight we'll be looking at its origins in the Mishnah, which is the earliest compilation of rabbinic literature from about the 2nd century CE, and the Gemara, which is commentaries and reflections on the Mishnah, which is together the Talmud, which spans several hundred years after the Mishnah. And we'll see that the term is really different in these texts than how we've been using it since the mid-20th century. And my goal is not to cast aspersions on how we use the term now. Tikkun Olam, rightfully so, is very inspiring to people. It puts into words their Jewish values, and I do not mean to at all denigrate that. And I think an essential part of Judaism is social justice and is making the world a better place. But when we look at the origin of the term, I think we learn something different, not to put a negative light on how we use it today, but really the original meaning on its own terms, I think offers us something to think about. So each text is fairly halachic, fairly centered on a Jewish legal issue. So we're going to have to kind of get into the legal world of each text, but I'm going to guide you on that. And we will see a pattern that what all these texts have in common in their use, in their structure, but also in how they seem to define Tikkun Olam. So we'll close tonight with hopefully an understanding of what the rabbinic notion of Tikkun Olam was, and maybe if we have time, a discussion on what do we find moving in it or not. So I am going to, at this point, share my screen. And again, I also copied the texts in the chat, if you prefer it that way. So the first text is from the Gemara, Masechet Gitin, which is means divorce, get plural, a bill of divorce. And this particular situation, before we read it, is about voiding a get in another city. So if you think about, okay, a get dissolves the marriage. So what's voiding a get? Voiding a get is restoring the marriage. It's canceling the divorce. So a get is a bill of divorce. It's very, very important. Without a valid get, a wife cannot remarry. She is stuck. Now, the husband is not stuck because polygamy was allowed by Jewish law. That's a whole other story. But the wife in particular was stuck, couldn't remarry, couldn't move on in her status. So getting everything right with the get is extremely important for that reason. And it is the husband who delivers the get. It's the wife who receives it. So what happens if you, the husband, want to change your mind, or maybe you both decide to change your mind and you want to void the get, you want to get back together, essentially restore the marriage. So there was a practice of, you were allowed by halakha as a man to void the get in another city. You go to a court, and whatever city you happen to be, maybe it was just convenient for you, and you go through a process of making the get null and void. But a problem arose when this permissible thing started to happen. So that's when we're going to dive in here. The Mishnah relates that initially, a husband who wished to render the bill of divorce void would convene a court elsewhere and render the bill of divorce void in the presence of the court before it reached his wife, presumably in another city. Rabban Gamliel the elder instituted an ordinance that one should not do this, mipnei tikkun haolam, because of tikkun olam. Okay, so what does that mean? This is actually the Mishnah. Now we're going to get into an explanation in the Gemara later. The Mishnah taught that Rabban Gamliel the elder instituted that one may not render a bill of divorce void in a court elsewhere, because of Tikkun Olam. The Gemara asks, well, what problem did Rabban Gamliel ameliorate? Sorry, I'm trying to keep my screen going here. I have to scroll down. There we go. What did he try to ameliorate that was considered to be for the betterment of the world, mipnei tikkun olam? Well, they don't know. They're taking a guess. Rabbi Yochanan says it's for the benefit of potential children born from an adulterous relationship, mamzerim. The husband might render the get void, and the wife in another city might not ever find out. Maybe the messenger didn't notify her. She might remarry thinking she was divorced, but she was in fact still married to her first husband. And so the children born from that second marriage, which wasn't a legal marriage, will be what's called mamzerim, children of an illegal union. So to prevent this problem of the wife not knowing and remarrying and her children are mamzerim, to prevent this, Rabban Gamliel said, yes, we said it was allowed by Jewish law, but actually you cannot go and nullify a get in another city. The wife has to be there so that we know she knows. That's answer number one of the problem that this practice led to. Reish Lakish often argues with Rabbi Yochanan. He has a different explanation. He says, for the betterment of deserted wives, okay, lest women who receive their bill of divorce by means of the husband's agent, okay, so they get a shaliach, an agent, they receive the get, they might refrain from remarrying out of the concern that perhaps their husband went to another city and nullified the get. So that actually it's a very different problem. It's that she's afraid to remarry because she doesn't trust the get. She doesn't know if her husband has nullified it in another city. So, so this is our first example here with not necessarily in the order of the Talmud, but the first text I'm bringing to you, which is two potential problems that can arise from a completely permissible practice. And that is connected. So you have a permissible practice, you're going to now make it not allowed because of Tikkun Olam. So already in this text, what's different already about Tikkun Olam compared to what we shared in the chat before? What's similar, what's different? I think we have few enough people that people can unmute themselves if they wish and speak up. I can't necessarily see everybody's raised hand, so just unmute and speak up if you'd like to give it a whirl.
I never thought of Tikkun Olam as a specific marriage, you know, like to apply to specific people that in that kind of context.
A very specific context, like if this specific thing happens, yes.
Yeah.
That's a way it's different than what we said. Anything else occur to you? Well, if no one else wants to talk,
I guess I feel like this is not, when we think of Tikkun Olam, it's a modern context. It's about doing something that makes the world better, that like helps a group of people who are badly in need. And the first case is like, I guess you could consider like children who don't know from their, or were born in an adulterous marriage to be badly in need, but it's not what we usually think of when we're thinking about helping, you know, people who are poor or people who don't have rights.
Correct. It's a really Jewishly specific problem they're worried about, right? That only impact Jews. The Olam part of it seems to be not such a big deal. The world, right? It seems to be pretty confined to the observant Jewish world. Thank you, Irene. So we're going to go on to.
Oh, I was going to say it's not just it's not just the Jewish world. It's that it's so minor, it's so enclosed. It's not this universal concept. It's a very tiny, very particular group, and more personal as opposed to expansive.
Yes, right. Any ways in which you've noticed that it might be similar to what we said at the beginning about
Daniel has his hand up.
Oh, I can't see hands, but now I see it. Daniel, please.
Well, this looks to me like an example, and I don't think this is directly answering your question, Rabbi, but it looks like a question between two teachers about trying to preserve the world through preserving a marriage and making sure that that remains as intact as potentially possible. As the Talmud does, these two experts argue about it. But there's also a premise in the Talmud that is in the book, in Tractate Yoma, that talks about mitzvahs not displacing other mitzvahs. So this seems like a reverse of that in a kind of way. And I'm just wondering if that adds to the equation.
That's so interesting. I know where you got Tractate Yoma from Daf Yomi. Yes, that's really interesting. I think we'll see that more in other texts. And I had not thought about the other thing you said, which is marriage. I mean, marriage is the future, and it's the future of the Jewish people, and it's the future of the world, if you're going to bring world into it, part of the phrase. And now that you said that, I think there are some other texts that relate to marriage. And I had not thought about that before, but that's a really interesting thing, a way of looking at these texts. So I love seeing your faces, but I'm going to go back to the screen. We're going to go to the next text, also from Masechet Gittin. This time it's about redeeming captives. So when, again, it's Jewish, when Jews are held captive, taken as prisoners, it is a big mitzvah to redeem them from captivity. So that's the background. So redeeming people from captivity is a very, very important mitzvah in our tradition. So we're going to see how that relates to the use of our term. And I'm sharing again. Okay, so this is the Mishnah. The captives are not redeemed for more than their actual monetary value. Mipnei Tikkun ha'olam, because of Tikkun olam. Okay, so they're not, this is a law. You should, when you redeem captives, like you buy their freedom, it can't be, you can't pay too much, right? It can't be more than their actual value. And one may not aid the captives in their attempt to escape from their captors. Mipnei Tikkun ha'olam. So that kidnappers will not be more restrictive with their captives to prevent them from escaping. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, for the betterment of the captives, mipnei takanat hashvuyim, so that the kidnappers will not avenge the escape of the captives by treating other captives with cruelty. So again, we have two concerns of the same situation. Well, two different. The first one is a problem if you should redeem, we're going to get to that actually, if you should redeem for more than their value, okay, if you pay too much to redeem a captive. But now let's go to the second one, which they're really focusing on at this point. You can't help them escape, actually. Why? Because there's a danger that the kidnappers are going to get much stricter and much harsher in preventing their other captives from escaping. And so it might solve the individual problem of the one captive you're redeeming, but it creates more problems for everybody who's still there, who's still captured. And that this idea of avenging that Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel raised. So we're going down to the Gemara here in page 45a. Ibaelahu, a dilemma was raised before the sages. With regard to this expression, Mipnei Tikkun ha'olam, is it due to the financial pressure of the community? Is the concern that the increase in price will lead to the community assuming financial pressures it will not be able to manage, right? If wealthy people pay a lot to redeem their captive relatives, is it going to become unreachable for poorer people? Is the community not going to be able to sustain this? So let's all agree we're going to keep the price low so that we can redeem as many captives as possible. Or, Odilma, or perhaps, is it because the result of this will be that they will not seize and bring additional captives, as they will see that it is not worthwhile for them to take Jewish captives? Is the reason we restrict the money because it'll just be less appealing to the kidnappers? If they know they're not going to get much money from anyone, no matter how rich, then maybe we'll stop this whole practice to begin with. And that isn't answered. Which one is it? Maybe it's both, but the sages here see two benefits to keeping the price of redeeming captives low, not having rich people spend more. And that's because the community might not be able to sustain it. It's going to keep driving the price up. And perhaps otherwise, it may actually be an effective way of preventing people from being kidnapped if the kidnappers know they're not going to make a lot of money from it. So any new ways that this text sheds light on the term Tikkun Olam for you? Wouldn't helping them escape be a better deterrent? Since if it pays to kidnap, the kidnappers will keep doing it. That's true. Maybe helping them escape probably originally was a good idea, but they saw that it had a problem with the captives that still remained. The US government's position, I can't speak of, but if anyone knows the US government's position on captives, I don't know. Does anyone know?
You don't negotiate for hostages? Isn't that what's same thing, right?
Yeah, maybe.
This is Ronnie. I see a theme of the individual versus the community, or the short run versus the long run, or the narrow view versus a broader view. So I see all of those as questions or at least considerations.
I think that really does come up in this one. Like, sure, you could pay a lot and get your relative out, but what happens to everybody else who you didn't get out? They could be treated with more cruelty. Or the short run, the immediate benefit of redeeming a captive versus the long run. What's going to really tamp down this practice? So I like how you said that. And off the top of my head, it doesn't seem that our modern use of Tikkun Olam goes in that way, short-term versus long-term, off the top of my head. Dan, yes, please.
Well, it looks to me like this is an example of something that was legal at the time. Captives were legally taken. We can argue with that through our 21st century lens. But at the time, there were legal prescriptions about it. So this was one of those things that keeps the world intact again by attempting to make sure that these captives are treated with respect and not exploited by raising up the price all the way and making them abused therein.
Right. Michelle wrote in the chat, I did not like the concept of setting a price for a person. Me too, Michelle. It does not sound comfortable with us. The market rate of a person, yeah.
I guess I'm extremely uncomfortable with that, but I think that there is some way in which employers inherently do that because they offer often different people different salaries for the same job. If someone comes in with more experience, that person might get offered a higher salary. If someone has better personality chemistry with the interviewer, that person could get offered a higher salary. So I think that even though, you know, in the United States today, we don't have captives in the way that they did at the time, there is still some degree for which, you know, different people are offered different salaries, sometimes because, you know, maybe they are coming in with more experience and maybe they're going to be asked to work longer hours, but sometimes just for arbitrary reasons. And when it happens for arbitrary reasons, at least from friends of mine who've been at workplaces and having myself in a workplace where I felt it happened for an arbitrary reason, it leads to all sorts of ugly dynamics that really aren't good. So I think there is still something we can take away from that.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on this text about captives?
I think that with the Holocaust, you could.
Oh, Carrie, you went mute. Unmute yourself
Okay.
again. Yes, please start again.
With the Holocaust, you can throw all that out. We just needed to get our people to have a world.
Right.
So, you know, that was the thing. just get the people, no matter which way you can, out. So
Right.
we still had a Jewish population. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was where the short term was really dramatic and important. And Rose added in the chat, there's an economic idea of the value of a statistical life. Like I think actuaries and life insurance, they figure that out. And she also feels very uncomfortable about it. Doesn't sit well. Okay, we're going to be, I'm going to preview our next text, which is from Masechet Pesachim, which is the plural of Pesach. It actually concerns this strange phenomenon of someone who is half slave and half free. What does that mean? Well, first of all, you're a Jewish slave, and you have two owners who are Jewish, and one has freed you and the other one has not. So you used to have two owners, you only have one now. So kind of half of you is free and half of you is not. This becomes an issue with the Pesach sacrifice, the Korban Pesach, which was the meal eaten in the time of the temple, in the observance of Pesach, the first night. And it had to be eaten in a group, which was actually called a chavurah. It had to be eaten in a group. And you had to form a group to eat it. You didn't eat it alone. And usually the group was your family or whatever, but you had to have a designated group. So what do you do if you're half slave and half free? Who's your group, right? Is it the master you still have? What if you want to eat with your old master who maybe now is a friend or an equal? You know, how does that work? But also if you're a slave, you have to eat with your master and his group. But if you're free, you can be part of any group you choose. So what's his status if he's half slave, half free? So again, this is such a specific situation, which all of these are. And we're going to go back to the source sheet. Oops. Sorry, I'm having trouble scrolling. Whoops. There we go. Okay. Here we go. The status of the half slave is altered, such as he is considered like a free man as pertains to his inclusion in a group for the Paschal Lamb. So that's the discussion. Okay, he's half slave, half free. Treat him like a free man when it comes to which group he can join to eat the Korban Pesach. Okay. As we learned in a Mishnah, and here's the Mishnah's quoted, one who is half slave and half free serves his master one day and himself one day. So that's how you reconcile this strange status. Day one, you're serving your master. Day two, you're a free person. It alternates day by day. That is the solution Beit Hillel came up with in general about what do you do with a half slave and half free person. Now, Beit Shammai, just to back up if you're not familiar, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, those schools of thought argued with each other. Almost always Beit Hillel won out, and our laws follow Beit Hillel in the vast majority of situations. Beit Shammai, we record his reasoning, but we very, very rarely rule by him. So now we're going down to more about this. Tikkantem, which is the same root as tikkun olam, tikkantem et rabo, you've remedied the situation of his master, who benefits fully from all his rights to the slave, right? He gets him 50% of the time as a slave. The et atzmo lo tikkantem, but his own situation you have not remedied. Now here that word tikkun is used as remedy in English. You've solved the problem for the master. He gets his slave 50% of the time, but this poor fellow, you haven't solved anything. How? And Dan, listen to this because this gets into marriage. He is not able to marry a maidservant since half of him is already free. So he can't marry a female slave because he's half free. And a free Jew may not marry a Canaanite maidservant. He is also not able to marry a free woman since half of him is still a slave. And if you say he should be idle and not marry, But isn't it true that the world was created only for procreation? V'halo lo nivra ha'olam ela lefriya u'rivia, like pru revu, be fruitful and multiply. As it is stated, God did not create it to be a waste. God formed it to be inhabited. So he's in an impossible situation regarding marriage, being half free and half slave. That's the problem with Beit Hillel's solution. It solves the problem for the master. He gets his slave half the time. It doesn't solve a personal problem and a future problem for this poor half slave, half free man. So how do they resolve it? Ella, mipnei tikkun ha'olam, for the improvement of the world, we force his master to make him a free man. So the one master who's still enslaved, we force him to free that guy. And the slave writes a bill accepting his responsibility to pay half his value to his master. So he has to buy his freedom. It's all written down. And that's the ultimate version of the Mishnah, records the retraction of Beit Hillel. So this was Beit Shammai's view. You got to make the guy who's still his master free him. Then he's a free person all around. He can marry who he wants. That's what we need to do. That's the tikkun. Now, this is really, really rare. I can't think of another instance in the Talmud. There probably is one. V'chazru Beit Hillel leharot b'Beit Shammai. And Beit Hillel retracted his position and ruled like Beit Shammai. This is really, really rare. So Beit Hillel said, I defer to you. Beit Shammai, you're right. The better tikkun is to force the master to free him so he's entirely free, so he can get married and have a future. So this is a really fascinating text. Any reflections on the concept of tikkun olam from Masechet Pesachim there? Dan?
I love it. I just love it. Beit Hillel is seeing the value in another person's view on this, and he realizes that the half slave, half free person is going to be stuck if it goes his way for the rest of his existence in this going back and forth between freedom and the master. And he sees that there's an alternative to this, and so you force the slave owner to let the slave go free. And then you resolve the responsibility on the slave's part, responsibility loosely, by having the slave pay for half of his freedom. I think it's really cool.
I also think it goes back in a way to the problem with our first text, which was if the man's really allowed to nullify the divorce in another city, the woman might not know, and she could have illegitimate children, or the woman might be afraid to remarry because she's not going to know if he's done that in another city. It's the same problem. She's stuck. And so this stuckness around marriage, procreation, that's because procreation is mentioned in this text too, about marriage and procreation, the stuckness is really the problem. And the other really interesting thing is Beit Shammai is usually stricter and less humane. In Beit Hillel usually sees the big picture and is more lenient, and it's the reverse here. Beit Hillel just says, well, we've got to make sure the master has 50% of the labor of the slave. And Beit Shammai sees the big picture of how this could affect this person's life. So it's a reversal in so many ways. So again, going back to our own conception of tikkun olam, back to perhaps what the other texts have raised, how do you respond to this very odd and specific situation and what it says about the concept tikkun olam? What are you repairing?
I think I'd like to back up for a sec, because the master is in a win-win situation, because he either has the slave or the slave has to buy his freedom.
True.
Okay, and for me, frankly, when I think of Sheikh Sharar, I think about home demolitions, and then the person whose home has been demolished gets to pay for the demolition of his own home.
Wow. Yeah, it doesn't seem so compassionate to make this poor fellow pay for his own freedom.
I mean,
know.
I think if someone's been working without pay for somebody for an extended period of time, isn't that more than enough? I mean, I do think that Shammai is being more humane, but I think the real humane thing is just to say we're done with slavery.
Yes, absolutely.
I am
right.
not of the view that, you know, white masters in our country should have been paid back when they were forced to let their slaves go free. I don't think they should have. I don't think their former slaves owe them anything.
We're doing so much reckoning in our own country around this, you know, with colleges in the South that used to be plantations that profited from the wealth of plantation owners, and slaves built their buildings. And, you know, it's so complex. And I see that discomfort with having the slave owner being rewarded. And I guess the only thing I can say is when you go back to the Torah and the early rabbinic period, where slavery was allowed in the whole ancient world, it's very troubling to us, and it's hard for us to get past that. But nonetheless, within that box, within that system that maybe itself is unjust, there's ways to create more justice. I think that's what this text shows. Louise.
Also a totally different form of slavery. So for instance, especially if it was a Jewish slave, because every 7 years you had to free all the slaves, right? So
yes.
So therefore, there was a limit to how many years the master did make money out of the slave. It's really a totally different. Slavery wasn't by race. It wasn't by. It was a much more random kind of thing of who was a slave and who wasn't.
And in some cases, it was really an indentured servant. You were trying to pay off a debt by enslaving yourself to someone.
Right. And we had in this country indentured servitude, where people would sign up in England, let's say, and come over and they have to work 7 years to pay back their fare, you know, or whatever you want to call it. And then they were free people. So it's different from American slavery, which is based on a whole different thing. I'm a historian, so I can't help it.
Thank you for your point. And we have another raised hand over here. Dan?
Nobody would ever suggest that this is the way to solve this problem today. That was then. What is important about this Talmudic example is that it was groundbreaking. This was a civilization in which there was no regard for these kinds of captives by any people other than that's recorded in Talmudic literature. That doesn't mean that we should do it this way today.
Yeah, I say yay for us. You know, we tried. I mean, you know, yay for us back then. You know, we saw a problem, we're trying to fix it. Good.
So when we use, just my own reflection right now, I didn't think about this before, but when we use the Tikkun Olam term today, we often have very lofty ideas of what that means. Like it's really perfecting the world. It's really making the world a perfect place. This example is not making the world a perfect place. It's solving a very particular problem, right? Okay, our last text is back to Masechet Gitin. In fact, it's in some ways the most radical, and it also ties into what Louise was referring to, which has to do with the 7-year cycle, which was the sabbatical year that was to some extent is observed still today, but was definitely observed in biblical and rabbinic times, which is a cycle of 7 years. The first 6 years, normal years, so to speak. The 7th year, the land has to lie fallow. You don't cultivate your land. Agricultural work is suspended, and anything that grows on its own is ownerless. So the poor can take from anyone's land, and the land lies fallow. That's one thing that happens in the 7th year, the sabbatical year. And the other thing that happens is debts are forgiven, which means if you owed somebody money, and this is the kind of slavery that was then manumitted then. Generally, slaves, I believe, were free in the 50th year, the Jubilee. But the kind of, if you had a debt, your debt was forgiven the 7th year, whatever you had left to owe. Wouldn't that be great with student loans? But anyway, so the debts were forgiven every 7 years. That is Torah law. It is in the Torah. It's what we call de'oraita. So in Jewish law, something that's explicitly in the Torah as a law has a very high status compared to something that came later, that was created by the rabbis. Any law that goes back to a biblical verse, to a verse in the Torah, cannot be changed. It can be reinterpreted, it cannot be changed. It is very high value. And we call that de'oraita, from the Torah in Aramaic. So this forgiving debts every 7 years is from the Torah explicitly. But something bad started to happen. And we will see what. I'm going to go back to share the screen. Okay. Okay, the Mishnah lists additional ordinances that were instituted for Tikkun Olam. So Masechet Gittin, Tractate Gittin is a really good place to go if you're looking for Tikkun Olam. I brought you some, but not all of the sources. The witnesses sign their names on a bill of divorce, even though it's not required for Tikkun Olam. So another divorce thing. We're not going to get into that, but this is a thing we're going to get into. And Hillel, remember Hillel from Beit Hillel? Hillel instituted a document that prevents the sabbatical year from abrogating an outstanding debt. Mipnei Tikkun Haolam. Hillel said, we're done with this. I know it's a Torah law, but we are no longer going to cancel people's debts in the 7th year. Why? So then the Gemara seeks to explain. The Mishnah taught, oops, sorry about the scrolling. The Mishnah taught that Hillel the elder instituted a document that prevents the sabbatical year from abrogating an outstanding debt. And that word was called prosbol, which was believed to be a Greek word. We learned in the Mishnah, in a different part of the Talmud, if one writes a prosbol, that's this document, the sabbatical year does not cancel debt. This is one of the matters that Hillel the elder, Hillel HaZaken, instituted because he saw, this was the problem that happened. He saw that people of the nation were refraining from lending to one another around the time of the sabbatical year. Jews were afraid of lending to other Jews because they were concerned that the debtor would not repay the loan. Oh my gosh, it's year 5. If I make a loan with you, it'll be canceled in year 7. I don't want to give you a loan. And they violated a value in the Torah, which was, beware that there be not a base thought in your heart, saying the 7th year, the year of release is at hand, and your eye be evil against your needy brother and you give him nothing. That's from the book of Deuteronomy. Be careful that you don't have that base thought of feeling uncomfortable with lending to somebody because the 7th year is approaching. So Hillel arose and instituted the prosbol so that it would be possible to collect those debts in order to ensure that people would continue to give their loans. And this is the essence of the text of the prosbol. Here's the text. I transfer to you so-and-so the judges who are in such a place that I will collect any debt that I am owed by so-and-so whenever I wish, as the court now has the right to collect the debt. So they transfer the collection to the court, and the judges or the witnesses sign below, and this is sufficient. The creditor will then be able to collect the debt on behalf of the court, and the court can give it to him. So the Talmud asks, and this is just an astounding question they repeat several times, Umi ika midi de mida oraita mishmata shvi'it v'hitkin hillel de lo mishmata? Is there anything like this in our tradition, where by Torah law, the sabbatical year should cancel debts, but Hillel instituted that it shouldn't cancel the debt? Look at Hillel, he's changing a Torah law. How could this be? And, this is, there's more to the text, but yeah, we don't have all night. We do have all night, but not in my session. And so this dramatic line keeps repeating. I can't believe the chutzpah of Hillel that he thinks he can undo a law from the Torah. But what did Hillel really do? He pulled out another value from the book of Deuteronomy that said you shouldn't have a base feeling in your heart and be afraid to lend money to the poor. So in order to prevent that problem, you got to change the Torah law. And it was changed. And this is radical. It really is radical for the world of halakha, of rabbinic Judaism, radical to effectively cancel and uproot a law from the Torah because something morally wrong was happening. People weren't able to get loans. So that's in many ways the most dramatic. And now I think we can reflect. I know the meeting is ending very soon. We have 5 more minutes. Reflect real quick before we close. What is the pattern in these texts? Is there a pattern you've noticed? A structural pattern?
Something
Oh, Mark, were you trying to speak? No. You're not unmuted.
Oh, there. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, you know, in all of these, there seems to be a tendency not so much to change, to make the correct the present in order to in terms of thinking about the future, about how the present action is going to affect the future.
Right.
Whereas in our concept of Tikkun Olam today, I don't know, it almost seems like it's to repair the world. It almost seems like it's connected to our concept of a messianic age. That and maybe even the conversion of the Messiah to a concept of a messianic age, where we're trying to bring about this messianic age by repairing our world today.
Yeah.
Maybe in part connected also to the concept of utopian visions.
Mm-hmm. Irene, did you want to say something? I thought you had your hand. Yeah, go ahead.
This seems actually in some ways related to what you were talking about before of getting people unstuck, where you have, if a woman never trusts a get, she'll never feel like she can marry again. And then she's stuck. If a half slave can't marry, then that half slave is stuck. And here we have, if people are unwilling to lend money, then poor people who with a small loan could get themselves out of poverty then become stuck and not able to make their lives better. And I think in that way, Tikkun Olam at the time was maybe a sort of more smaller, directed, specific version of what we have today, where I think a lot of Tikkun Olam today is also about getting people unstuck. If we're helping people living in poverty find jobs or find, more reliable sources of food or healthcare, that's also getting them unstuck.
Thank you. That was a great connection. We have 3 minutes, 2.5 minutes. Any other thoughts? Any other comments? Otherwise, I will wrap up by saying what I see. That what it seems to be, all these texts have the structure of there's this permissible thing in Jewish law. Everything's okay. It's legal. But what happens is that real life interferes in ways that weren't ever intended by this law. Something happens, an outcome happens in real life as a result of this law that conflicts with other values we have. And so you have to remedy the original law to prevent that outcome from occurring. In a way, you are bringing values to this system of Jewish law and these unintended consequences that are negative for people. And it's a very narrow view of Tikkun Olam because it's saying the world is these legal frameworks we've created as Jews. The world is the rabbinic world of all this halakha, all these Jewish laws. That's the world of this. And fixing it is literally remedying a wrong that we couldn't have anticipated from something permissible and making something no longer permissible. That's the structure that seems to happen. And I think it's similar and yet different from how we use the term Tikkun Olam. So I like a both and approach. Tikkun Olam, the way we use it 20th and 21st century, is inspiring for a lot of people. It means that they bring their values to their Judaism and their Judaism informs their values. And they have a vision of making the world a better place. And their actions should be driven by that vision. That's not a small thing. That's an important thing. And yet this rabbinic conception is important too, because it's saying whatever little worlds we create, we're responsible for the outcomes. And we've got to always go back and make sure that our actions or our laws don't have unintended negative outcomes for people. And we also have to make sure that our values are supported by halakha, by our Jewish laws. So thank you for joining me. I want to wish everybody a Chag Sameach, a happy Shavuot to come, beautiful weather and festivities as we have a little bit more freedom from coronavirus with this holiday. Thank you for being with me and look forward to connecting in another forum.
Thank you, very inspiring.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Amy.